Greetings all and welcome to today's lecture. We're going to be finishing up our talk about theropods by focusing more specifically on birds. Of course, we did that last week, but this time we're focusing on Cenozoic birds. That's right. We've been talking about the Mesozoic in the past. In fact, we're going to talk about the Mesozoic for most of this class, but birds are still with us here in the Cenozoic, so it's only appropriate that we talk about their history post the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction, or Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction, to be a little bit more up to date. All right, let's go ahead and there's another thing that I wanted to add here. Yeah. All right, so Cenozoic birds, a dinosaur's world. Okay, so the Mesozoic is often referred to as the age of dinosaurs, or the age of reptiles, both names which are pretty freaking misleading because it implies that that age is over in some way. In fact, it's pretty frequent that you will see the Cenozoic referred to as the age of mammals. And yet there are between 4,000 and 5,000 mammal species alive today. There are between 10 and 20,000 dinosaur species alive today. The world of the dinosaurs is not over. The world of the dinosaurs is as diverse as it's ever been. It's just restricted to a single clade of theropod dinosaurs, the birds themselves. Really, really interesting group of animals. It is still a dinosaur's world. All right. So let's get back to what we were talking about. Last time we were going through all the different bird groups, and we talked about the ornithurae, how that's divided into a few groups of closely related birds, two of which, the ichthyornithids and the hesperornithids, are both extinct. They look a little bit like modern birds. The ichthyornithids look a little bit like seagulls. The hesperornithids look a little bit like loons, except they're 6 feet long and flightless. But neither of them are related to those groups. It's just convergent evolution. And one of the ways we can tell that is because they have big old teeth in their skulls. Aves doesn't have that. All right, so ornithuromorpha. What makes an ornithuran bird? Let's see. They originate about 167 million years ago somewhere in Eurasia. Pubis, ilium, and ischium are all parallel to one another. This is all stuff that you heard last time. They're fewer vertebral part of their rib cage, which makes their rib cage less flexible. The less movement in the rib cage during flight, the more of that energy is transferred from the muscles to the wings. So more efficient flying comes from having a stiffer rib cage. They have a smaller hip socket. They have a place for a kneecap. And now into aves. Aves is split into two groups, the Paleognathae and the Neognathae. We're going to talk about the Paleognathae in just a minute, but let's talk about aves in general first. We already talked about that. What makes an avian? They originate about 166 million years ago, again, somewhere in Eurasia. They have no teeth. There are two major clades within aves, the Paleognathae, or ancient-jawed birds, and the Neognathae, or new-jawed birds. The Paleognaths are an extremely small clade right now. There are very few things in them. I think I can list most of them just off the top of my head. Extant paleognaths include the ostrich, the largest living bird, the emu from Australia, the rhea from South America, from Northern Australia and New Guinea, the cassowary from New Zealand, the kiwi, and the only flying paleognath bird that is still with us is from South America. And let me see if I can pull up a picture of that for you real quick. The tinamou. It's hard to spell. So here is a tinamou, a still flying bird. They don't fly that great, frankly. They're a little bit like chickens. Or turkeys, they can fly short distances. They actually sort of resemble chickens and turkeys, but they are related to the ostriches and the rheas and the emus and all the rest of it based on the way their skull is put together. They have a little bit less flexibility between the bones in their skull than we see in the neognath birds, particularly in relation to the way that their jaws are put together, hence the name. The tinamou is probably a pretty good approximation of what the earliest paleognaths would look like. For some reason, paleognaths have repeatedly evolved flightlessness throughout their evolution, and we've never come up with a particularly good explanation for why that might be. And it's also very odd that a group of birds that started out all being capable of flight are now completely incapable of flight, except for one genus, the tinamou itself. Very, very strange the way that worked out. All right. Getting into the neognathi, we got a couple of different groups here. The neo-aves, which means near birds, and the gallo-anseri, which means the chicken ducks, which we'll explain momentarily, that name. Ornithomorphae, aves, let's see, what makes a neognath? Okay. A little bit confusing the way that this one is put together, but that's okay. What makes a neognath? As we continue on here, the furthest back bone in the palate no longer connects to the brain case, so the palate is the roof of the mouth. The front bones of the palate hinge with the middle bones of the palate, meaning that birds all have flexible jaws, which to mammals, which have notoriously stiff jaws, is bizarre. But if you think about things like lizards and snakes, the ability for skull bones to move relative to one another, something called cranial kinesis, is actually really common in tetrapods. It just happens to be lacking in our group. And there is a one fewer bone in neognaths in the skull than we see in paleognaths here. So that's an interesting group of critters. There's the neognaths, two groups. One of them is the neo-aves. We're going to get into that in a moment. The other one is the gallo-anseri. Gallo-anseri are actually a very successful group of birds. They are the basal-most neognaths, so they branched off from the rest of the neognaths, the neo-aves, relatively early on, and gave rise to everything fowl that's alive today. And by fowl, I mean land fowl and waterfowl. The duck and chicken families all belong to gallo-anseri, tremendously successful groups, not as successful as the passerines, which we're going to get to towards the end of this little explanation, but still very successful group of animals. Some of them were pretty crazy. A lot of them look like modern ducks and chickens and geese and turkeys, everything in that family. But there were some oddballs. The one that you're looking at here in the little circle is an almost blind and flightless cave duck from the big island of Hawaii. That apparently made its living by searching around in leaf litter for insects and stuff. Extinct now, unfortunately, very strange creature. There were also the demon ducks of doom, which were really a little bit more closely related to geese, but were something like 6 to 9 feet tall and several hundred pounds, also capable of running at high speed and, of course, incapable of flying. Gallo-anseri is a fascinating group of birds. The only bird that I own is a gallo-anserine bird, specifically Lady Ada Lovelace the chicken. All right, moving forward a little bit here and getting into the neo-aves. We have a number of important groups of neo-avians, which we're going to get into in a minute. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about how these guys evolved. That's a little bit out of behind. What makes a neo-avian? They evolved 135 million years ago in Eurasia. They're defined by genetic markers. So from here on, we're going to see a whole bunch of groups of birds that are not obviously physically similar to one another, but have DNA that indicates a close relationship. And this is going to crop up again and again and again. In many cases, I suspect that if we look long and hard enough, we will find physical traits that can connect the groups together, but for a lot of groups, this is not something that we see today. We also mention here that neo-avians tend to be smaller than non-neo-avian neognath birds, or smarter rather, and the capacity for evil is strongly linked to intelligence. And in animals, here is a penguin dope slapping his friend as an example. Now, the main group that we're going to be talking about in here is the Anopanaves, but I want to just go ahead and mention the other major groups that we have in the neo-avians that we're not going to give a whole bunch of time to. The Acorlitornithes are the penguins and their closest relatives. They are restricted to the southern hemisphere, and people often think of them as being strictly Antarctic birds. This is not the case. They live as far north, almost as far north, as the equator, and there are lots of tropical penguins. There are lots that live in very, very cold areas in the southern hemisphere as well, but as long as you're in the southern hemisphere near an ocean, your odds of seeing a penguin are not low. Next up, we have the frogmouths and flycatchers of various times, the Strozories, which are pretty entertaining looking animals. Tremendously huge mouths. They catch insects on the wing. Here's a nightjar, which is a member of that group. And here's a frogmouth bird, which looks like an angry Muppet with a happy Muppet baby. They're pretty awesome, quite frankly. Columbates includes all of the pigeons, doves, and their closest relatives, including some really unusual ones, like the now extinct dodo, which is essentially an extremely large flightless pigeon. And then finally, the gruiformes, and this is where all of the cranes fit in. So sandhill cranes that you occasionally see flying across Nebraska, or various eastern cranes you see in our part of the country that may have led it to some of the initial Mothman sightings, all fit into the gruiforms. All right, moving forward, we have the Inopanaves. So this is the main group within the Neoaves that we are going to focus on. All right. What makes a neo-avian? Well, we don't know exactly when they, or what makes an Anopanavian? We don't know exactly where the Anopanavians show up. They're defined by genetic markers primarily. The main group in the Anopanaves are the Telluraves. That's what we're going to spend a whole bunch of the rest of the time talking about. But there is also a group that contains just a single family, just a single genus, and just a single species, and that's the Opisthocomiformes. You've seen this picture a couple of times now. This is a picture of a Hoatzin, the really, really cool birds that live in South America and whose babies still have hands so they can climb around in the forest. In the trees right after they hatch. I have an adult Hoatzin as a picture back here a short distance. Adult Hoatzins are pretty striking birds. You still don't want to get particularly near them because they're capable of accurate projectile vomit to a range of several tens of feet. That's how they defend themselves. They also have the capacity to ferment food in their stomach to make the leaves they eat more palatable, which is unique among birds. All right. But most Anopanaves are in Telluraves. All right. Telluraves. We've got three groups in here, which we'll get into in a little bit. What makes a Telluravian? We do not know. They're defined strictly by genetic markers at this time. What do we have in Telluraves? Well, we have the Afroaves, which includes things like kookaburras and kingfishers, very colorful, largely predatory birds, some of them eating things like lizards, like the kookaburras do, and some of them eating fish, like kingfishers. We have the Accipitromorphae, and the Accipitromorphae contains almost, but not quite, all of the birds of prey that you might be familiar with. So owls can fit into the Accipitromorphae, so do vultures, so do hawks, so do eagles, and a number of other related animals. The accipitromorphae have been pretty spectacular at different times in Earth's history. The largest of the accipitromorphans that were capable of flying were known as Argentinavis. Argentinavis was the largest flying bird ever. Let's go over here and pick up, see if we can get a picture of Argentinavis. Argentinavis, I'm sorry, which means silver bird. It's named for Argentina, of course. All right, so Argentinavis has something like a 6-meter wingspan, giving it a wingspan in excess of 20 feet, making it the size of, say, an ultralight plane, and dwarfing its somewhat close relative, the Andean condor, considerably in size. Tremendously huge birds. Went extinct in the Miocene, probably about 20 million years ago. The largest accipitromorphan bird that we ever ran into would have been the Haast's eagle. Haast's eagle, also a pretty large bird, and may have been capable of killing and eating human children, making it perhaps the only bird of prey that has served as an actual threat to human life and limb in human history, which is pretty cool as well. Okay, get back over here. Not going to spend any more time on this. The rest of them that we're going to talk about are the Australaves, and Australaves originate probably in the southern hemisphere, as the name might indicate to you, perhaps in South America, perhaps in Australia or Antarctica. We'll get into that in a moment. All right, Australaves. We got a couple of different groups in here. We'll get into them in a second. What makes an Australavian? We're not entirely sure when they originate, but they originate in South America, and they are linked to one another entirely through genetic markers. We have two major groups of Australavians. One of them is quite a small group consisting of just a few surviving species, the Cariamiformes. Cariamiformes include some South American birds. Let's see if I can find a good picture of one. Siramas fit into this category. That's a pretty good picture of a Sirama. Oh, it's tiny. Never mind. Let me get a bigger picture of a Sirama. Some of them are pretty cute. So Siramas are all that's left of the Cariamiformes in South America today. They're pretty interesting birds. They're perfectly capable of flying, quite well, in fact, but they do all of their hunting on the ground. Essentially, they walk around in the grasslands, particularly in the pampas of Argentina in South America, and look for small creatures that they can stomp to death before eating them. You might be wondering if an animal like this, given a long enough time, might become flightless entirely, and you would be right. And in fact, it's happened within the Cariamiformes before. While Siramas are the only ones that we have left today, we used to have a much wider variety of Cariamiformes, a group of animals known as the forest rockids, or more popularly, the terror birds. Terror birds are, for whatever reason, almost always depicted as kicking the living crap out of a small horse. They're pretty dramatic animals. That might be my wife coming in down there, so we'll get through this real quick. So here is a terror bird murdering the crap out of some small furry animal. They're interesting in that they had extremely strong necks, extremely sharp beaks, and remarkably weak jaws. The conclusion that paleontologists have come to from this, albeit tentatively, is they would essentially open their mouths and use their entire head as a hatchet. to slam into the prey, driving the point of their beak into their body or brain, which is pretty cool. Terror birds were almost exclusively South American, but a few of them got into North America when North and South America met up, going into the Miocene and Pliocene. So we did have some as far north as Florida and Texas. For whatever reason, they ended up being outcompeted by mammals eventually. And the age where large predatory dinosaurs were apex predators in South America, and briefly in North America, is now long since over, which is a pity because they're super cool. That's the Caryomorphes, but most Australasians are within this other group, the Euphalconomorphae. We'll get into in a moment. Euphalconomorphae includes two groups, the Falconiformes, which we'll talk about in a second, and the Psittacopassae. What do we know about these guys? We don't know where they originated. We don't know when they originated. The group's defined mostly on genetic markers, but they do actually have something in common with each other. Physically, they have a single trait that links all the Euphalconomorphans, and that is the ability to generate lift on the upstroke as well as the downstroke of the wing. Other birds are only generating lift when they bring their wings down. Euphalconomorphans can generate lift when they bring their wings up, and therefore the finest flyers in the entire world of birds are generally Euphalconomorphans. They're able to fly more efficiently and also faster. The fastest animal that we know of, not counting animals in a vehicle, I suppose, would be the peregrine falcon, which is obviously a Euphalconomorphan, capable of moving at over 200 miles per hour in a dive. So remarkably fast animals here. We're going to be concentrating mostly on the Psittacopassae, but we do have the Falconiformes in this group. And this is a really interesting thing because this is something that's been discovered just in the last 15 or 20 years. The Falconiformes, which you probably have guessed includes falcons, were for a long time placed in a completely different group. Based on their overall appearance, we thought they belonged in, get back here a little bit, Accipitromorphae, along with the hawks and the eagles and the buzzards and the owls and whatnot. But what we find when we look at the way that they're put together in detail and when we look at their genetics is that falcons, despite looking very hawk or eagle-like, are not particularly closely related to either group. In fact, falcons seem to be more closely related to songbirds and parrots. They are essentially a member of the songbird / parrot lineage that has convergently evolved to look like a hawk, which is a pretty crazy thing to be able to do. Falconiformes are also unusual in their ability to dispatch prey by punching the crap out of it with their feet. So they will go into a high-speed dive aiming at, say, a pigeon in the city somewhere, and hit the small of the pigeon's back with a balled up fist made of their feet. Obviously, they're not using their wings, break the thing's back and knock it out of the sky. So Falconiformes, super, super interesting, but the majority of Falconiformes are within the Euphalconomorphae, the majority of the Falconomorphae are actually in this other group called the Psittacopassae, which are closely related to the Falconiformes. So let's get over into that. Here's the Psittacopassae. Psittacopassae consists of the Passeriformes, tremendously successful animals, and the Psittaciformes, which are also pretty successful and pretty impressive animals. Get into that in just a second. What makes a Psittacopasserine bird? Well, they're defined primarily by genetic characteristics, but they also all share a capacity for learning and duplicating sounds. Some of them can only learn the sounds that their parents make or other members of their species make, where some members are capable of mimicking the sounds of other birds, the speech of humans, or even things like camera shutters and chainsaws, like we saw in that other video. They also have a relatively well-developed capacity for being dicks, because again, it takes some intelligence to be a complete asshole. Let's go ahead and take a look at this video, I hope. Dun, 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 dun. Well, that's irritating. All right, let's just go to YouTube and do this the long way around. Oh, sorry. All right. So just to demonstrate a psittacopasserine bird's capacity to be kind of a dick. Here it comes. Remarkably nimble feet in what's called a zygodactyl position, where two of them face forward and two of them face backward. They're also capable of using their beak as kind of a third hand, if you like to put it that way. The psittaciformes within the Psittacopasserinae include some of the most intelligent birds in the world. Parrots are particularly well known for their high intelligence, and among the parrots, the African gray parrot may be the single smartest. There's variation in intelligence in animals, even among animals of the same species. You can have very smart ones and very dumb ones. And the smartest individual bird that we know of may have been Alex the parrot, which died just a few years ago, unfortunately. Parrots do live quite a number of decades, 50, 60, 70 years, pretty routinely, but they don't last forever. And Alex passed away 5 or 10 years ago now. Alex seemed to be capable of having something like an intelligent conversation with people. Other African gray parrots are capable of remarkable feats of problem solving and mimicry, but actually being able to talk with them cogently seems to have only ever happened in one of them, which is kind of an amazing thing. Hartley here just wants to destroy things. Some parrots just want to see the world burn. That for just a second. I don't know why I like this particular video, but it does amuse me to some degree. Seems to be experimenting with making different noises by screaming into the cup, or again, he's just being irritating deliberately. Either way, it's pretty cool. Okay, enough of that. All right. So now we're getting into the passerines. Psittacopasserines, the group we just talked about. Psittaciformes includes just parrots and cockatoos and cockatiels and budgies and macaws and their relatives, and the rest of them are in the Passeriformes. These are often referred to as passerine birds. What makes a passerine bird? Well, they originate relatively recently, about 34 million years ago in New Zealand or Australia. They spread relatively rapidly from there. There are, at a minimum, about 10,000 modern bird species. Around 6,000 of them are passerine birds. Most birds are passerine birds. These are birds with what's called an anisodactyl foot. That's where 3 of the toes point forward and 1 of the toe points backward, allowing them to grip branches efficiently. They also have a mechanism in their feet that allows them to grip branches without expending muscular effort, which means they can perch and fall asleep, giving this group of birds one of its names, the perching birds. They have a very complex vocal apparatus. Of course, we have that present in the parrot family as well, but in passerines, it's even a little bit more complex than that, enabling them to make an extremely wide range of very complicated sounds, which is why we give them their other name, the songbirds. There's no webbing between the toes. They have a boiling murderous rage, a capacity for grudges, and the loss of a soul. What you're looking at here is an animal called the butcher bird, and the butcher bird is so named because it will kill more than it can eat, and then it will impale its prey on thorns or on the sharp parts of a barbed wire fence as a larder, so that it can go back and get food without having to hunt again. To put it another way, they will kill in abundance and then store what's left over, which is pretty impressive as well. The other contender for smartest birds outside of the Psittaciformes are within the passerine birds. And those are the crows and blue jays and ravens, all of which make a family called the corvidae. Corvids are extremely smart as well. You already saw a couple of videos on crows solving puzzles, both naturally occurring and developed for the laboratory. Remarkable, remarkable animals. A question that you will sometimes see posed online, and sometimes even a question that's brought up and thought about by paleontologists, is what would it look like if a dinosaur involved human level or near human level intelligence? And the answer is probably not like a crazy Star Trek, Star Wars style lizard person. It's probably a New Caledonian crow. All right, that's all we're going to spend time on theropods. Next time, we're moving on to sauropods, the other major group of saurischian dinosaurs, so look forward to it.